How much does it contribute to the formation of identity, the transfer of views from generation to generation to the world from a psychological perspective? Therefore, a selection is made from both psychology and theology topics, and today, in order to understand an individual's behaviors, attitudes, feelings, and thoughts, the interaction of the individual with the religiosity of that personality is explained using the data of psychology. Or the relationships between religiosity and mental health are interpreted using the information of mental health.
Hello everyone from Istanbul School, dear audience. Today we will talk about the relationship between religion and psychology. Our guest is Prof. Dr. Ayten. Welcome, teacher.
Welcome home. How are you?
Thank you. How are you?
I'm very well. Thank you very much.
We want to talk about the relationship between religion and psychology. How does religion view psychology? Let's start with this if you want. What is the religious perspective on psychology? How do you interpret it?
Of course, psychology is a modern science, that is, it emerged at the end of the 19th century. Naturally, religion can have different perspectives on all sciences, and each religion can have different perspectives. But when you look at how Islam views psychology in general, the Prophet Muhammad said, "Wisdom is the lost property of the believer. Even if it is in China, it is found in the light of the fact that in order to be able to catch the spirit of the age and time, all sciences, including science and social sciences, in fact, a Muslim or a religious perspective is expected to be positive." But of course, the perspective of religion or religious people or conservatism towards psychology has been a bit distant in the historical process and has always contained question marks. Of course, one of the most fundamental reasons for this is that, especially in psychology, the great theorists who deal with psychology have a somewhat negative perspective on religion. The most beautiful and obvious example of this is Sigmund Freud and Freud's perspective that embellishes religion with somewhat negative content, a reductionist perspective. Therefore, we can say that this has been met with question marks, especially in the Islamic world, and has negatively affected their perspectives on psychology. Of course, we can see that this has been resolved over time because, especially after the 1950s and 60s, the fact that those interested in psychology, namely great psychologists, included religion and spirituality in their own thought systems, of course supported psychology to be loved by the public or to find more lively supporters. But there were also people who opposed this. Especially in the Islamic world, there have been approaches that claim that psychology and the theories produced in psychology are mostly produced in the Judeo-Christian tradition, and that they cannot explain our worldview, our mental world, our emotions, and our thoughts well enough, and that a more cultural and Islamic perspective should be developed. Therefore, if you ask how religion or the religious or conservatives view psychology, it is a bit difficult to express this in a tidy manner. There are many different layers to this business.
It is also a variable situation.
Of course, it is variable. It has a very variable structure depending on time, person, and place. But in general, there is such a perspective. What is happening in today's world, especially with the Muslim world becoming more and more familiar with psychology and the development of understandings that have now penetrated into this science of psychology and the studies carried out in the Islamic world to explain the behaviors, thoughts, and feelings of the Muslim individual. Muslims or religious people also feel a little closer to psychology, and they exhibit their stance on this issue by reproducing the theories there in their own contexts.
Isn't this exactly what we need, sir? Because if we are not interested in the information given by people who produce new theories such as Freud, Jung, or others interested in psychology based on their religion, by looking at the religions of those who produce these theories, then perhaps we need to reinterpret these together with our own religion and come up with new theories.
Of course. In other words, A completely rejecting approach that only excludes them, that is, we do not accept them, they do not suit us, is not a very healthy thing. After all, this is a knowledge accumulation, psychology brought by the world, by modern life. Because with our past cultural accumulations, we can no longer read and understand human behavior in a healthy way. That is why we need these theories. But of course, we need to be a little careful here. After all, every theory emerges in its own cultural accumulation and ideological and philosophical ground. That is why we need to reinterpret and explain them by sorting them out a little and reflecting our own perspective, local and religious perspective. We need to be careful about this.
Yes, we will take a critical look and evaluate it anyway.
It is absolutely necessary to develop a critical perspective, because when you look at the studies conducted in the Arab world and the Islamic world, this is already mentioned. In other words, it is necessary to include Islam's conception of a human being. It is necessary to include the basic religious texts of the Quran and the Sunnah. In addition, modern psychology and the theories developed within modern psychology need to be addressed in a very healthy way, and a philosophical critical perspective needs to be developed. Also, empirical, that is, experimental research needs to be done. In other words, what does a modern Muslim think today? Why is he affected by it? How are his emotions? What is his intellectual world? How is his perspective on the world? How does he enrich his religious life, his world of ideas, or how does he reflect this in his behaviors and attitudes? Studies need to be done on these, because in our mental world this is not very clear. In other words, we sometimes miss that nuance between what should be and what is. The sciences that will enable us to catch this are social sciences, and one of them is psychology. Therefore, we need to enter the world of psychology, penetrate those theories if necessary, and put forward our own theories about them.
So what were the views of these famous psychologists we mentioned, sir? How do you evaluate this?
Of course, the views of psychologists like Freud, Carl Gustav Jung, Erich Fromm, Alfred Adler, or Abraham Maslow, and later on Kenneth Pargament, are quite different from each other. But the view of Sigmund Freud, one of the doyens of this field, is quite negative about religion. Of course, in his period, people like Auguste Comte were more influenced by the Enlightenment and modern philosophy, and had a more distant and more exclusive perspective on religion. Of course, later psychologists who followed him were also influenced by his views. Even during the Ottoman period, when they were getting to know psychology, translations were made. They were aware of what was going on in the psychology community, and criticisms were developed about these. For example, there is a book by Hoka Suat Effendi. For example, he wrote a book called Asri Seytanlar Peygamberi in Ottoman 1923, I remember. He criticizes Freud there. In other words, he takes Freud's views and makes his own criticism. These were followed, but in the later period, Freud was also criticized a lot by his own friends, the psychology community. For example, K. Gustav Jung is one of them, a school that we can call the same school. Of course, these are debatable, but as I said, theorists after the 1950s and 1960s have a slightly more positive view on religion. At least they are doing studies that emphasize the functional structure of religion and its positive contributions to human mental health, social life, and individual integrity. And today there is a perspective that includes the psychology community in the process, both in the modern world and in the Islamic world.
This is a very valuable thing, sir. It seems very important that he read Freud at that time and wrote a critical refutation of him.
Definitely.
So, of course, the reflections of this today may be different. Some may reject it completely and pass by without mentioning it in any way. Some may criticize it and continue with denials. But we still touch on it in some way. It certainly cannot be something we ignore.
Absolutely, because in the end you can't just ignore them and continue. What needs to be done instead? This needs to be understood. In other words, why was such an interpretation made? Why was such a theory developed? And what could be the alternative to it? If you want to have a religious perspective, you need to present a human view, a human conception, especially when it comes to psychology based on your own religious perspective. And we need to develop new approaches that will contribute to theories that will explain human behavior. while doing this within the framework of the basic Quran and Hadith that I just mentioned, but also a perspective that understands and criticizes modern psychology, a perspective that can develop it, but also applications need to be made. In other words, there is a need for new studies that use modern technology and methods that evaluate the behaviors of Muslim individuals in a healthier way, that is, the methods used by psychology. As the number of these increases and the data becomes abundant, the prejudices against psychology in the Muslim world will be broken down, and the contribution of psychology to understanding more people, making people's lives better and more livable, or solving human problems will increase, I think.
In other words, they continue their work by keeping up with the times.
Absolutely, there is such a perspective in psychology as in every subject, just as we have a perspective on artificial intelligence and we are trying to catch it. In other words, we do this in every subject, from clothing technology, advertising sector, film industry. The field of psychology is something like that. Of course, one of the differences in psychology is that since it is a perspective aimed at understanding people, ideological differences inevitably become a topic of discussion at the table. Therefore, it has a slightly different stance in terms of being a social science. But the way to eliminate this is to develop a more holistic perspective by developing a critical perspective and reflecting the data we receive from the field on the issue, instead of accepting the theories developed by the West, or the West as they are, starting from your own philosophical and intellectual foundation.
Yes, Muslims actually have very important responsibilities here.
Absolutely. In other words, people who are interested in religion and psychology in particular have important responsibilities in this regard.
Well, there is also a field called religious psychology. What is religious psychology? In other words, can religion have a psychology?
Yes, can religion have a psychology? Of course, what is meant here is not the psychology of religion. In fact, what is meant is the psychology of the individual who somehow establishes a relationship with religion.
The psychology of the religious.
We can call it the psychology of the religious, or it can also be the psychology of the irreligious, because the psychology of religion has a perspective that deals with all kinds of relationships that an individual has with religion. In other words, it can be distant from religion, or it can be a perspective that is connected to religion in a healthy way and reflects it in their daily life. In other words, we call this religious. For example, it looks at how effective the behaviors of the religious, how effective religion is. Of course, it uses the data of psychology while doing this. In other words, whatever method psychology uses, the psychology of religion also uses the same methods to measure and identify the behaviors, attitudes, feelings, ideas of the religious or the person who has a relationship with religion in some way. Of course, things like I said are also very important here. In other words, it is important to apply the methods psychology uses in a healthy way. Otherwise, you are psychologizing the issue but not doing psychology. The psychology of religion deals with this. For example, examining why a non-believer does not believe is again a subject of the psychology of religion. Or with what owners and motivations an atheist person becomes an atheist, why they do not give place to religion in their life, or how they make sense of the world with the ideas that religion replaces. These are again a subject of religious psychology. Or institutional religious structures, for example, the church in the West. More often, the Directorate of Religious Affairs in our country represent this. What effects do they have on people's behaviors or religious views, or how religious groups are effective in people's religious worlds are also of interest to religious psychology. In short, every type of relationship an individual establishes with religion, whether negative or positive, is the basic subject of religious psychology. When modern psychology was founded, it was in the late 18th century. In fact, the first psychologists were also important names interested in religious psychology. In other words, William James in America, who is both an important figure in philosophy and the founder of American psychology, he also wrote a book called The Variety of Religious Experience in 1902, and he is one of the founding fathers of the psychology of religion. Or Wilhelm Mund in Europe, who established a laboratory in Leipzig and became the founding father of psychology, for example, also addressed the subject of religion within cultural psychology and made a contribution to the psychology of religion. And later on, for example, Stanley Hall, for example, gave the first psychology of religion course at Harvard University in America. It was the 1887s, that is, the end of the 19th century. I am telling this because when psychology first emerged, the subjects of the psychology of religion were actually discussed very lively. Why? In Europe, religion somehow continues to exist within psychology or the psychological world. What is it today? Similarly, in the West, there are more psychology departments in psychology departments, and they are studied there. In Turkey, there are mostly psychology departments in the faculties of theology. In the Arab world, psychiatrists in psychology departments are interested in this psychology of religion department, and they are looking for answers to the questions of what psychology does, what a person does, what kind of behaviors they exhibit, and why they exhibit this, which are effective in human life. In this process, does religion or any relationship that an individual has with religion have an effect on that person's behavior or attitudes? In general, it seeks answers to this question.
So what are the most basic issues in religious psychology, Professor? What points does he try to emphasize the most?
There was a subject that I mentioned earlier. In other words, when pioneers of psychology in America, such as William James or Stanley Hall, started teaching religious psychology courses in psychology faculties or faculties with social sciences content, the first subject they generally preferred was religious conversion, because at that time this interdenominational transition, that is the transition from one religious group to another, and the change between religions was a very problematic structure. Maybe that's why they were curious about it. In other words, why do people change their religion? This subject has been on the agenda a lot. Today, it is still one of the most traditional and fundamental subjects of religious psychology, the subject of religious conversion, the subject they call religious conversion. Sometimes this involves the transition from one religion to another, sometimes any kind of change within religion, that is, a person who has distanced himself from religion at a certain period of his life may have experienced a trauma in some way after the age of 35, 40. It may be the result of losing a family member. It may be in the form of being imprisoned. He may have had a health problem, or any traumatic event may have occurred. It may be in the form of a search for meaning and turning to a religion, or as a result of a search, that is, an intellectual search. Any religious change of this kind can be the subject of religious psychology. Or we see it a lot in the Christian world. For example, a person who is a Christian or was born in a Christian family, raised by Christian parents, becomes a Muslim after a certain age. This subject, for example, is the basic subject of religious psychology. In other words, why does he change religion? What processes does he go through to reach such a stage and makes a decision? What kind of problems does he experience later in terms of identity, social life? What changes do they have in their life? What are the differences in the world of meaning? Many subjects are one of the most basic subjects of religious psychology. For example, religiosity. People read the same text differently. Thousands of people take different things and reflect them in their lives in different ways. How come people who read the same text produce different behaviors? For example, think about the issue of personality. Some people are more responsible, but religion manifests itself differently in that person. Some people are more irresponsible, or some people are introverted, some people are extroverted. This also affects their religious experiences. Or some people are open to experience, some have a more closed personality, It can affect their religiosity. These are, for example, a subject, or religion and mental health are very basic subjects. How do people's religious views affect their health? How does it affect their mental health? After all, the way people's mental health problems emerge, the way they manifest themselves, are ultimately related to cultural phenomena. Sometimes, for example, we hear in our society they say this man is possessed. In fact, it can indicate a psychiatric and psychological problem, or it can say that the person has been struck by the evil eye but cannot explain the issue, or their family explains the problem between the husband and wife, for example, with magic, the evil eye, etc. But there is a communication problem, a problem of incompatibility. For example, they can explain it like this. Of course, these affect it. In other words, those cultural elements talk about these things.
Can we provide a psychological explanation for all of this?
Absolutely. I mean, it also uses data from psychology. Of course, it also uses religious and cultural data. In fact, the psychology of religion is an interdisciplinary field, and I think it can put forward useful, very healthy ideas. and it produces ideas that can support especially Muslim individuals on many issues that they may need. It presents new findings. In addition to these, it also addresses other topics. What kind of differences do religious practices, for example, fasting in human life, for example, fasting during Ramadan, create in human life? Or how does going to church or not for a Christian reflect on his/her life? For example, identity. An important part of religion is identity. In other words, when we define ourselves, we say, I am a Muslim, or I am a woman, I am a man, then I am a Muslim, or I am a Christian. One of the most important elements that people use to define themselves is religion. And it is one of the elements that affects our perspective on the world, our meaning of life, our philosophy of life. That is why this is also, it is again addressed in terms of religious psychology. In other words, how much does it contribute to the formation of identity, the transfer of worldviews from generation to generation, from a psychological perspective? That is why a selection is made from the topics of both psychology and theology. And today, in order to understand an individual's behaviors, attitudes, feelings, and thoughts, psychology data is used. When I say using data from psychology, for example, religious development is explained with the general characteristics of adolescence, or by using personality theories, the interaction of an individual's personality with their religiosity is explained, or by using information from mental health. The relationships between religiosity and mental health are interpreted.
Okay, sir. Thank you very much for your valuable comments. We have opened a door. In fact, this is a very broad issue that needs to be examined separately.
Absolutely, but we have made an introduction.
Hopefully, it will be instrumental in raising awareness and perspective on religious psychology.
Today, it is not possible to explain human behavior with a single science. Therefore, we need multidisciplinary approaches and different perspectives. Only in this way can we get a better understanding and a closer explanation of the truth. The combination of psychology, sociology, anthropology, and other fields provides an important basis for understanding complex human behavior. Ultimately, these multiple perspectives help us gain a more comprehensive understanding of the dynamics of the individual and society.
I hope so, teacher. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Dear viewers, this week we talked about the relationship between religion and psychology at Istanbul School. See you in the next episode. Goodbye.